Welcome back to Design Huddle. It's a podcast where two internet friends step inside the minds of creative designers in a variety of disciplines and learn how design impacts our everyday lives. We have an amazing guest today. We haven't had a guest in a while, so thank you, Jason, for showing up. I'm going to give a very brief intro of Jason, and then I'll let Mustafa and Jason kind of fill in the blanks. But Jason is a design strategist, author, speaker, UX leader, technologist, just like an expert of the web. Overall, just like great guy from the 10 minutes I met him before joining the call. He's worked in a variety of impressive organizations: Adobe, Audible, Condé Nast, GoDaddy, IBM. And he's given presentations, workshops, spoken at conferences all over the world. And he also has a newsletter on web typography. We'll make sure we link that in the show notes. What did I miss? Mustafa, this is your dear friend. So
the last line you missed, and I think you've worried about it. What I try to do is like a sort of a joke line where I say he's probably best known, and I've written he's probably best known for his love of whales, because I saw on Twitter someone called you, I think, Moby, because you like to do. So welcome, Jason.
Thank you. Actually, you'd probably, I don't know if I can get him in frame, but most people actually know me best for that guy. That's Tristan. And his cousin Tilly is outside. And really, like, the only thing you need to know is if you want good pictures of fluffy dogs, then you can follow me on Instagram.
Sounds perfect.
And they also make really, so he's a rough collie, and his cousin is also, obviously, because they're cousins, but they make really good examples for variable fonts. So they have made lots of appearances in my talks over the years. That's really all I'm good for. But so one interesting thing, at least I think it's interesting, I'm interested in it anyway, that I'm also involved in is the last few years I've been an invited expert in the web fonts working group at the W3C.
Oh, that's great.
And that kind of all fits into some of the things that we were talking about just before we hit record. So I'll say them again, or at least paraphrase it a little bit. What has been really interesting. So for anyone who doesn't know me, the thing that I focused on the most over the last 10 years has been web typography. I started studying graphic design in our sort of early 90s, and my first job on campus when I was in school was making the school's first website. And so I've been in web stuff for a really long time, and I love typography, but so I will say right now, I will just piggyback and reference back to many things that Mandy talked about a few weeks ago. She is a good friend, and I absolutely adore her and the work that she does, and I'm constantly blown away by her creativity and knowledge with stuff. And Jello, her dog, who is awesome. And that's Tristan speaking up about that.
You both seem to have figured out how to use Instagram. I mean, I don't know if it's my age, but I look at Instagram and I don't understand this website. I'm just posting random things from my art history background. It's like, that might get a few likes. I don't know if I'm doing it right.
Oh, I believe me, I will not even pretend to think that I have figured it out, but I will say that it is a comfort to me. Like, I was like, whatever it does for anybody else, like, I hope they appreciate it. But I started doing that. Well, Tristan is just about to turn 13. And I started this, and we got him when he was 4 months old. And I probably started posting stuff regularly online, like photos, like a photo every day. Maybe a few months prior to that. It was actually kind of inspired by Dan Rubin, whom I'd met at some conferences, and he was it was kind of like people were just starting to do these like 30-day challenges or 365-day challenge of whatever, and so he was doing this thing, posting photos all the time, and I decided that I needed something like that little bit of creativity. So Instagram wasn't even out yet, so it was just on Twitter at the time, and my challenge to myself was to make a little piece of art every day, if I could, or at least try. And so I think that it has added a little bit of sanity to me. I'm always trying to figure out like an interesting image of some kind, and I don't know that it's always successful. And it has certainly, um, now since I'm not traveling much, it's really it's our dog walks in the morning. That's mostly what it is, and then occasional cycling photos. But but that's like the heart of it is still there. I'm trying to find an interesting composition, try and think a little bit more visually about stuff, and that's the only thing I let myself take the phone out of my pocket for in the morning.
That's
That's
cool.
I try anyway. So, try and be a little bit turned off and, other than looking for that little moment that I can capture or that little story that I can tell.
We'll probably go into like the W3C stuff, or the technical stuff in more detail. But one thing I was curious about is the W3C seems like a very technical place for a designer to be. And in terms of just like the design visual language is very specific, and if you have an art background, people can sometimes relate to it, or they something they learn over time. How do you feel like working in that environment where you're trying to articulate the importance of typography, and sometimes it's hard to quantify that with metrics and data, but it's like instinctively um,
Right.
how do you manage that?
Um, well, I'll answer that, but I think the first thing that I want to say is the W3C is a group of people that, by and large, there's a massive number of them that really care about text. I mean, there's like if you've spent any time at all, and you work on a browser, so I'm sure that you have, reading CSS specifications, the level of thought and detail and care that went into defining the specs around hyphenation is
Yeah.
staggering. I mean, and so there it's like there's these pockets of it that are amazing, and whether or not all of it's been implemented is a totally different question. Um, but I have found that there is more and more recently. Tristan really has a lot to say about this. Um, there's been an interest in engaging more with the type community, which has been awesome. That's actually where I kind of first became connected with the web font working group. Um, was in 2018. They held the CSS working group held a meeting at Typo Labs in Berlin, and I was invited along with a few other people from the web design and web development and type worlds to kind of come in and sit in on a meeting, and we are talking about a lot of things related to variable fonts and other aspects of implementation of typography.
Yeah.
And um, so I think there actually is a great interest in those working groups in having more experts from these adjacent areas engaged, so that we get naming right, that we get um, details right about what we need on the web as practitioners. And so that whole shift of the W3C over to GitHub, that was huge. So that really made the ability to participate much easier.
Hmm.
And so you can link people to an issue and say, here's where the discussion is happening. And so I try and do that and really follow the lead of folks like Jen Simmons and Rachel Andrew and others to get more people into that conversation. And so I I've had very good luck in the reception of the ideas that I have as a designer, as a technologist, or in trying to fit into that conversation. What I've had to do is understand the depth to which they need something considered and defined before it could be made part of the CSS specification. Because that's, as we have our own use case in mind with something, and we want to focus in on that, and we can describe that particular use case, and then they come back with 47 other ways that this would be implemented on the web in different languages and directions
Yeah.
and writing modes and stuff. And for something to be fully baked, you've got to consider all those things. So as a designer, you really have to think about it from a system perspective, which is a good exercise as a designer, but it is definitely something that sort of goes beyond what many of us, I think, would naturally be inclined to do. Is we solve the problem at hand, and maybe it's a problem at hand in the context of a design system or something, but But this goes way beyond that. It's the design system, the browser implementation. What do the fonts support? What does the language support, and how does that differ? So there's so many different issues there. Even just getting better link underlining.
Yeah,
Well, that's really cool, except some languages use overlining. I'm
yeah,
like, whoa, I didn't know that.
yeah. Of
So,
course.
like defining that offset has to go in more than one direction, and so like there's interesting nuances to it like that um, I think really fit into our world as designers in challenging our own assumptions and biases and what we know of the world. So again, like even something like a link underline, you then have your brain sort of expanded, like, okay, well, that's one set of scripts. What about Devanagari? What about Chinese, Japanese, Korean,
Yeah.
Arabic? How do those languages behave? How do those scripts behave? And what's good and what's normal there? I love it. I mean, there's
Yeah.
you can go so deep into any one of those little wells.
Jason, do you mind taking a step back for a second? So we have some designers that follow Design Huddle that are not like web design designers. So can you just give
Sure.
an overview of W3C? And I'd also love to hear about like how you got selected. I feel like that's like a great honor. Like a lot of designers would love to have that kind of like responsibility, I think is like a good word for it. So I'd love to just hear like an overview for anyone that doesn't know, and then another step of just like how did you progress into that, and like how can people get more involved,
Sure.
in the W3C.
Yeah. Oh, I that's perfect. I would love to answer that. So the W3C is the body that is responsible for the standardization of HTML, CSS, even JavaScript. So like any of these web specifications that are what we all count on as web designers and web developers to build the web. All of that stuff is housed by the W3C, and so that's the standards body that defines what is an HTML tag and how does it behave, what is a CSS selector and how does it behave, and then the job of the W3C is to define those things really thoroughly in a way that covers all of the ambiguity and all the different use cases, and then that is the basis by which browser teams then look at that specification and decide how they want to implement it. And so it is literally what is the building blocks. That's our material of the web, at lowercase m. So I don't want to confuse that with anything at Google, but this is the stuff of which the web is made. The analogy for designers who are graphic designers and are coming from more traditional forms of media, it is your paper, it's your ink, it's your varnish, it's your die cuts, it's all of those things that graphic designers grow up learning and knowing about the producing of a physical thing. This is the analogy of the web. So not to stir up that pot of designers and code, but that is it. That is literally like understanding what those things are and how they behave is that a fundamental part of designing for the web.
Yeah, that's super
And
clear.
yeah, I actually do want to stir up that pot. No, more the thing with the code thing. I actually look at code as in the same way that I suppose graphic designers might look at printers, and how a printer would help prepare the work in like the tools. I know the classical designers would have been putting things on lead plates and stuff like that, and building up this, like the whole process would have been the designer. But at some point, just for scale, that became a role, and the designer their tools and process became different. But I don't actually see like much difference. I remember when this was when we first met. Okay, going back to 2014. It may have been Monotype gave a talk at the conference Future of Web Design, where they explained at smaller sizes letters were slightly curved on a lead plate because if they didn't it would bleed. And this is like a very technical thing, but I think, oh wow, like that's like the coding equivalent of blur. So I mean, what do you think about?
Yeah.
I've said lots of things there, Jason. You can unpick that.
Well, there's so much to go into there, and it actually ties in so much with variable fonts. But I don't think I really answered all of Ryan's question. So because that's endless. You just open the door to like another 4 days of this podcast. So I hope
Yeah.
everybody's like ready for that.
Well, I
But
didn't, Jason, we didn't tell you, but we're actually going to try to break the record for the longest podcast stream. So we have the next 3.5 days are going to be wild.
all right, all right.
But yeah, thank you for circling back. Just the process of like getting there. Like, I think that's super
Yeah.
cool. I think that's I don't know anybody other than you that's in that body. So I'd love to hear how you got there and like what the process looks like.
Yeah. The process was envy and jealousy and shameless self-promotion. But we could probably be a little less flippant about that. I think I want to start in 2010 because that is when I got a beta invite to Typekit. It still, or I guess maybe that was 2009. I got a beta invite to Typekit, and I started using web fonts. So reference back to Mandy's episode when she talked about Cipher and QFont. I suffered with that for a couple of years, and then Typekit launched, and that was the first time that you could embed real fonts easily on a web page. And what I immediately noticed were some of the things that people complained about, and one of those things was FOUT, or flash of unstyled text, and that was the condition, and we still see it today, where text shows up on the screen in Times New Roman or Helvetica or Arial or whatever, and then it like flips into the web font and the page redraws, and very often your navigation reflows, your headlines reflow, things jump around, and anybody that's thinking long and hard about core web vitals right now, which is like everyone on the web, that's a big problem. So talk about like repainting a massive amount of the screen because your text metrics are all different, and that was a real problem, and a lot of people were refusing to use web fonts because that problem existed. And I started noodling around with some ideas. Google was working at the time, I think, collaborating with Bram Stein, who's currently at Adobe, creating the web font loader, and that was the precursor to what Bram has done recently called Font Face Observer. And that was a way to add some classes into the page during the loading process so that you could do something about it. You'd know whether or not the fonts were there. And that kind of gave me an idea where, well, then the problem with FOUT is the U, it's the unstyled part. So if you style the fallback fonts during the loading process, then nobody notices. It's like a JPEG coming in and sharpening up, or like a GIF, coming in pixelated and then fully loading and looking sharper. So it's the same kind of idea. And I had started working on a module for Drupal to integrate Typekit, and at 2000, where I gave my first talk actually ever at a conference was at Future of Web Design in New York in 2010 in the fall, and I met someone from Monotype there. They were just launching their web font service, and I just walked up and I said, "Hey, you guys doing anything in open source stuff? I'm doing this stuff with Typekit and Drupal, and I'd love to help if there's anything I can do." And that was my introduction to Monotype. And flash forward like a month or two, they're headquartered in Boston, which is about an hour away from me, and they just invited me to come up to their office and said, "Well, this is really cool. We do want to collaborate with you on this because we do have open source stuff that we want to get into. But would you be interested in writing for our blog?" And so that was the first thing I wrote about, was how to deal with FOUT. How could you like tune up those fallback fonts so that you don't really notice that shift, and your layout doesn't reflow and your navigation stays in one place. And that's actually still something that not a lot of people think about, but it is absolutely a valid thing today. It's more and more important than ever with the shift in Core Web Vitals and the meaning of that. Reducing the layout shift. That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
And so my point with that was I was just interested. I was curious. And so I started working at something, and it's kind of similar to what Mandy said. It was a sanity thing. I wanted to play with something, and it led me to figure something out, and then realizing that nobody was really talking about how you could solve this problem. They were just lamenting the fact that it existed. And so that was kind of my way in the door there. And from that point forward, that's pretty much all I've spoken about at conferences is web typography, and how, not just what its meaning is and its importance aesthetically, but also technically. How can it improve the user experience? How can we implement it well so that it doesn't degrade the performance, it doesn't impede getting content rendered on the page, and so it's meant that. Sorry, I'm just opening the screen door so Tristan can go outside.
No, that's fine.
Um,
Our kids will probably running at some point screaming.
yeah. We keep it professional and classy here. We've
Of
got
course.
dogs wandering in and out.
Love it.
So it was showing up. It was being interested, and that is what has always opened the door for me in successive iterations of this stuff. It led to writing a book for O'Reilly about web typography, which came out right around the time that Mustafa and I met in London. It has gotten me invited to events all over the world, and that one in particular in Berlin at Typo Labs, there were a bunch of people from different browser teams that were there, and a lot of people from the W3C, and that's when I started hearing about stuff like, well, you could come to this meeting, and so I got to see things going on there, and then I realized that you could apply to be an invited expert, and I think I had done it once a while ago and never heard anything, but I did it again, and I just went to the people that I knew who were on that working group and said, hey, I applied for this, I really want to do it, and so it was showing up and being interested and engaged, and so that it was a remarkable realization for me that if you want to be engaged in the process of defining and moving the web forward, you just have to show up. And yes, there's more to it than that, but the discussion forums are open. And then when you start to participate more, then you start to learn a little bit more about how to participate. And when you want to, voice an opinion about something, you learn a little bit about how to support that opinion and say, well, I think this is really important. Here's the history, and here's the use case, and here's how I think it should behave. And it's a long process because they have a lot of work to do on a lot of different fronts, but that was really eye-opening for me, that if you want to be a part of how the web works, you can actually just stand up and say, hey, I would like to participate, and you can find a way in to do that.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, that's kind of like, even if you do pull back, like just career advice in general, show up. That's like it, with like my speaking career, pretty much a very similar path. I was angry about what was the trend at the time? Skeuomorphic and flat design. And then my friends at work said, "Oh, you're just jealous because you're not famous." And I wrote a letter to Net magazine, like the web design magazine, and the editor goes, "Oh, that's really interesting. You should write about this." And that was the path that led me to speaking and where I am.
Yeah,
so just showing up.
Well, and I think that there's something really to be said for remembering that if one person, so again, I'm stealing more from Mandy. I hope she appreciates how much she means to me in that manner. That if one person walks away from what you wrote, having solved that, helping them solve a problem, then that's a successful endeavor. And all of these things are just steps toward helping more people do stuff. I started from reading Lynchpin by Seth Godin back in like 2007, and the whole premise being just focus on giving away what you know, make yourself indispensable, and things come from that, and it's not like the secret recipe for world domination. It's just about the more you learn and the more you teach people, and this is my, the way I've always phrased it, is people hire the teacher, not the textbook. So
Yeah.
my whole my newsletter was basically my attempt to rewrite my book in a format that I own. It's not, the copyright isn't held by any publishing company, but it's all there for free. And then people will look at that and say, "Hey, could you help us implement that?" And that's
Yeah.
worked, and I'm happy with that.
That's excellent.
Because um,
Jason, with that newsletter format, real quick, how do you take something complicated and make it so simple? Because I just feel like web
have
typography,
I?
there's um, I feel like from the my small sample size, I feel like you do, and like that's one of the benefits that I think why you stand out as a conference speaker and a writer is that you're able to take something that's inherently complex, break it down so a junior UX designer or graphic designer or someone that's interested can kind of understand it. Is there any approaches you have, or is it kind of just like you've been in the industry for a while and that's it?
Um, no, I don't think there's anything magic about it. I mean, some people are more naturally inclined to teach or to write or to speak or whatever. But I think everybody everybody learns stuff, and I think the only secret or the trick, if there is one, is to focus in on a small piece that you can cover completely. And that's what I've tried to do with with the newsletter. I started out, the first couple things that I was writing in there was like, how do you do a drop cap? How do you? Um, I mean, it was, I really focused in on a small thing, like one thing, and can I give a little bit of background about why you might do this, and how would you do it, and then explain the code and kind of the concepts behind it, and then it just sort of like built from there, and I was just really trying to push my own knowledge of traditional typography, because it's always been an interest, but it was never something that, like, the program that I was in college was fairly limited. It was a small state school, so there were no like three courses in typography. It was sort of covered a little bit in the first semester, and that was pretty much it. So it was something I was interested in, but not something I had a lot of formal understanding of. So I would use this as an opportunity to look at books, read articles, look for examples, and then try and relate this given technique that I found in a book or found in a poster, or a graphic design annual or a record cover or whatever, and then and say like, okay, well, how might I do something like that? And so that's that. The newsletter was, and I'm like so behind in writing that. I can talk a little bit more about why, but um, that's that's what I've really wanted to do, and that kind of grew into the Moby Dick jokes. Um,
The
what I
whale.
did in the last number of issues of that is I've been working on typesetting Moby Dick, and in doing that, really trying to bring all of the techniques that I've focused on in variable fonts, in responsive typography, um, in interesting UI things and accessibility things, and bring that together into a single interface, and then push that a little further, and try and rethink how a book might work,
Yeah.
and what might a good reading experience be on a digital device, because I don't think anyone has really made a particularly transformative one yet,
Yeah.
and I think we could do. I think we could do that on the web, and the building blocks of it have been improving all the time. When I started first playing with some of these ideas, it only worked in one browser, and now it works in all the shipping browsers. Um, so um, so that was kind of the impetus of that, and I've been working on sort of improving that, and now I'm starting to try and build some talks around it to sort of show people how all of this might work.
So would you say like the best way to learn is to teach?
I think so. And teaching, that can take many forms.
Yeah.
It's writing a blog post. I wrote a blog post it was like 2007 about things that we did to make a Drupal site 508 compliant, which in the US is sort of the baseline of accessibility
Yeah.
standards. At the time, it was not as good as what like WCAG was even at that time with the 1.1 standard. But but it was still kind of an issue. There were starting to be some legal cases in the U.S., and so this was a good way to focus in on that. And so we solved all of the problems that this huge website had for CVS Caremark. So it's like they're now like a Fortune 10 company. They're like a Fortune 25 company at that point. So they were really concerned about meeting these accessibility requirements. And we did the audit, and it took us like 4 hours to do all the things that we needed to do, and that was it. And so I wrote a blog post about that. And for years, it was a top 5 Google search result if you searched 508 compliance in Drupal.
Yeah.
And so that was a powerful thing. I didn't invent anything new there. All I did was work with the tools that were available to solve a particular problem, and wrote a blog post about it that took me probably an hour. And that became something that solved challenges for many people for a long time. And that was I think that's kind of one of those things that really nudged me towards wanting to do that more and more. So, every talk I give, the slides are up on Noticed. It's all in HTML and CSS. You can pick it apart if you want. Um, I always try and keep everything that I do sort of out in public,
Yeah.
and oftentimes even the workshop code and stuff like that. I'll usually make those repositories open as well.
So, I mean, just I'm curious, is like, how did you actually get into the industry then in the beginning? Like, you started, because I started off as a graphic designer who saw the blink tag, the typical cliche. So how did you actually get in on these? Oh, but I think we lost Ryan because we've got technical issues sometimes with this platform. So he'll probably come back. If not, we'll just carry on.
Well, I hope so. So I got into it because I guess it was the beginning of my second year of school. I started getting involved in the web a little bit in the first year, and then the second year, my job on campus was working in the publishing services office, and the guy that hired me said, "Okay, the school needs a website. We need to figure out what a website is."
Yeah.
And it was they were still starting students off with the Lynx browser on Unix terminals at the time, and there weren't any books. So we sat down and we started looking for tutorials on the web, and we had the school's web server, sort of quote unquote, was a Power Mac 8500 on a table next to my desk, and so we figured out how to write HTML, and I figured I'd made a design, and we showed it to the college president, and he was like, "That's cool, okay." And so that was kind of it. And making the school's first website just opened the door. I mean, I had always I had been already been doing some freelance graphic design work, but as soon as this was in 1994, as soon as you could spell HTML, you could get side gigs making websites. Everybody wanted one, and that's really where it started. So it was interesting because I was just starting the graphic design program. As I'd gotten past the freshman fundamental stuff, and it was in graphic design 1 and learning and figuring out what HTML was at the same time. And so it's always been kind of fused for me. It's always been together, and over the years I've done .NET development, server infrastructure management, creative direction, and started building my own content management systems in 1997. And it's just, I don't know, I've never been able to separate those things, and I've never really wanted to.
Yeah.
I find it all fascinating, and that's the type stuff fuses all of that into an even smaller area. So you've got to know how to implement it. You need to know what the technical issues are. You need to know what the browser issues are. You need to know how all of that stuff can be brought together to make something beautiful and usable and readable and accessible. And I love that mix of all of those things together.
I mean, what would you say the difference between web and print typography is, if there is any? I mean, because ultimately it's about reading, and once you understand the accessibility of like contrast and hierarchy and all that sort of stuff, is there much of a difference after that point, I suppose?
Well, there is, and
That's a
actually,
great
I want to
question.
relate this back to something that you mentioned in the episode with Mandy. Um, I don't remember who brought it up, but the focus on reading, as you just mentioned, that was always my focus. It was about reducing the friction of the reading experience. How do you make it easier and more comfortable under as many circumstances as possible for somebody to get the content? And and eventually, at some point, I saw this tweet from Nina Stosinger, who works with Tobias Fairjones. She's a type designer and an educator, and teaches at Yale, and she's just brilliant. And she said something on Twitter about this idea um, of design, and I'm losing the specifics of it, but basically it got me thinking about design as an either reducing or increasing friction, and
Yeah,
it needs to do both of those things at different times. And if you think about, sometimes you actually want to make it, you want to add friction, you want to slow somebody down and get them to stop and consider a message. Really powerful poster design is not always going to be black text on a white ground. Oftentimes you're going to have to struggle a little bit, and that actually forces you to think about it a little bit more. The interaction between the type and image and foreground and background and layout. um, I think like that's some of the most powerful typography that you see. So actually, I think it needs to go in both directions at different times, and understanding that, and then embracing how we realize that on the web, that's the real trick. And that's one of the things that I've tried to focus more on recently, is how do we do both of those things. I think for reading typography, um, all of the basic tenets of good typography in print, almost all of them can be applied on the web, but you have to be able to relinquish some of the specificity and control. It's about
yeah.
proportion, not specific numbers.
That's
So,
something that graphic designers often struggle with when they first come to
oh,
web design,
oh,
because
totally.
everything is completely fixed.
Yes.
And it's like, what, I have to use algorithms to design? Does that mean I'm not a true designer now because I'm not defined everything in Illustrator or Quark, or was it InDesign?
Yeah. I mean, so I think that is absolutely the hardest thing for designers. And what I try and teach students, and what I try and teach, designers that I'm supposed to be leading, is to take a step back and think about the relative hierarchies that you are trying to create, not the specific point sizes you've chosen in InDesign. And once you start there, then you can start with an idea that the heading should be 3 times the size of the body copy. And if you get your elements of typographic style and you start reading through there, and that's what Robert Bringhurst said, so that's what I'm going to do. That's terrible on a small screen.
Yeah,
Like, it's really bad. And so that was really where I first kind of honed in on this idea of typography being responsive. Was looking at it on a small screen and a large one, and I started just doing a bunch of breakpoints so that you could bring the range. The dynamic range can be narrower on a small screen because you have fewer distractions, and so you end up with better line breaks in the headings, but it still has the same volume compared
yeah.
to the body copy. Whereas on a big screen, you have to compete with more things, but you also can be more expressive at a larger scale. So that's it. First, it was breakpoints. Then it was CSS locks that I learned about from Tim Brown, who's the head of typography at Adobe now. He was one of the first people at Typekit, and then he it was Marcus. Oh shoot, Reichmuller, I think, who originally wrote about it. But so CSS locks was really interesting, and now we can use clamp in CSS. So I kind of migrated to that now, where we can set the proportion on a small screen, and
Yeah.
then figure out how big we want it to get, and then let the browser do everything in between.
So
And
CSS clamp is almost like, say if you've come up with an algorithm that says the type size is going to change depending on the column width of a piece of text, which was like content queries, which was the thing which everyone wanted when I was looking at this stuff. And I think we've almost got that, but I'm so out of touch of the front end stuff. But clamping is like, you've got this beautiful algorithm, but the problem is if it gets too small, then it's unreadable. So clamp will stop it between a limit, right? Is that the general? So
yes, so
it won't go below 12 points or 12 pixels or whatever.
Right. So you set a low end, a high end, and then you set essentially a fluid value in the middle. And so that can be something based on viewport units, for example. So that's based on the width of the screen. And if you do that with combined in a calculation with a more fixed unit like a rem or an M, then you can still zoom it, which is important for accessibility. But generally speaking, you're saying I want it no smaller than, let's use pixel equivalents. Let's say I want it no smaller than 16 pixels on a small screen. On the large screen, let's say we're talking about body copy, I'd love it to be up to 20. So I just want that to scale just a little bit. But as the screen gets bigger, I'm giving it a value in the middle that is relative to the screen size. So then the browser, it is kind of creating an algorithm for you to say, like, as the screen gets bigger, it's going to sort of smoothly grow up to the largest size that you set. And then you can do the same thing. And if you can picture these sort of like logarithmic curves, so your body copy maybe goes up just a little bit, your second level headings go up a little bit more, and then the largest headings go up even more than that. And so you can get a really expressive large size on a big monitor where you're competing with ads or other sidebar elements or other interface elements on a larger screen. It still can get that relative attention that you want a headline to get.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like graphic design. Now, this is the thing, because I went to a traditional graphic design school, so the debates, the traditional design is like, well, you're not really designing, you're handing over the keys to the machine. But then I remember, like, Eric Spiekerman once was talking about designing the label of a medicine, like, say, diabetes. And now you could look at that and say, well, this is boring. But if you look at, in terms of the impact you're actually having on people and how you have to be so detailed in the considerations. You're not going to be designing this amazing custom piece of design, but in reality, what you're doing is far more important. There's a huge responsibility. And I think a lot of the trying to work with the machine is about that, rather than, no, I'm going to have 12 pixels or 12 points is going to be my body copy, and that's that. I mean, what would you say to that?
Well, I think it's absolutely true. And I really appreciate Eric's point of view on a lot of these things. That I'm very much of the school of thought that type is never going to be neutral. It's always going to influence the emotional tone of the content that it is conveying, and it's going to influence it one way or another. But it's never not going to influence that. And so now you are using that as part of your design elements to warm something up or cool it down. If you're designing packaging for medications, the care and thought that needs to go into what do the numerals look like is critical, because that stuff's going to be printed really small, and people with aging eyes are going to be trying to read it. So you need to be really thoughtful about what is the shape of a 3 versus an 8 versus a 6 and a 9. And how do those read at a small size? So that's the same thing when you go, from a small, inexpensive phone handset to, a 30-inch iMac screen or whatever the biggest size is these days. And that's those are very different considerations, but they're equally important. And so that's why I really appreciate that, focusing in on the how do we make this work well on the device. And so I'll usually default to what is 100% on a given device, because that's going to vary. Desktop browsers, basically it's 16 pixels, or at least 16, the equivalent of 16 pixels in our mind. Never mind how how high res the screen is. That doesn't come into it as much. But on a phone, deciding what 100% is handled by the device manufacturer and the operating system vendor who's setting up the software on there to say, okay, we think this is going to be readable text. They know better than I do, so that's what I default to. I don't set body copy any smaller than the default of 1 M effectively on a given device, and it'll only go bigger from there. And so I try and use the things that other people have figured out, and then
Yeah.
how do we improve upon that or build upon that from there. And the same thing can be applied, when you get into variable fonts and like what would you do. So now we're thinking about, as the device capabilities increase, it's not just the size of the text, but what's the mode in which you're seeing it. Is it a light mode or a dark
Yeah.
mode? So the variable fonts are amazing for that, because you might want to vary the weight of the text when you invert the contrast. So, depending on the typeface, in most cases, you want to go a little bit lighter when you have light text on a dark background, because that has a tendency to fatten up. I mean, our eyes, especially as they get older, that will lose sharpness and will kind of bleed together like an old CRT screen, if you can
When I,
think back that far.
when I was looking into variable fonts, there was a setting which I think comes from Asian typography, Asian as in China, Korea, Japan, and whatnot. And they have something that's not quite bold. It's something else. I've forgotten the term, where the text looks darker, but it doesn't change the width of the glyph.
Oh, well, so there
I can't remember
is
what it's called.
a notion called of grade,
That's the one.
and so that I'm not certain of this, but I think the first reference I heard of that was actually, I believe it was Tobias Frere Jones, who was working maybe with David Berlow. Um, I don't remember, but the idea was, in that case, it was trying to get, you're right, it's changing the stroke thickness or weight without changing the overall metrics.
Yeah.
And this originally, in the stories that I've heard about it, was to do with the different printing presses and inks and paper combinations to try and get something that visually looked the same on differing levels of quality and paper and
Ah.
ink and all of that stuff. So you could subtly shift it. Now grade is incredibly
Makes sense.
useful in this very instance, so that when you flip the contrast, you could change the grade axis. And so that's and Dalton Mogg actually has a typeface where they actually just have it like a dark and a light mode. It's just an on or off for for their variable fonts, or for one of them anyway, that I remember seeing. And that's exactly what it was doing. When you switched it to the dark mode axis, it would subtly reduce that. And so if you don't have a grade axis, you can reduce the weight just a little bit. And in some cases, you might want to just nudge out the letter spacing the tiniest little bit,
Yeah.
so that things don't reflow. The problem with that is you break ligatures when you mess with the letter spacing. So if you can shift the weight of the text, maybe, by 25 or 50 or something like that, it might not reflow anything. So that might work just as well.
I always found great, like when I saw that, when I was first looking into variable typography, I found that really fascinating, because one of the challenges on web design is like you've got this beautiful layout, but then the title breaks a widow onto another line, and it's like, I want this to be bold, and if it's not bold, it just loses its value. So, but the grade allowed you to maintain a degree of boldness if you had to compromise, but still without a complete refill of the page.
Right.
That's what I really found interesting. Ryan, I've been so excited talking with Jason, and you haven't said a thing because it's been so long, Jason.
No, I mean, to be honest, typography is not one of my domain expertise. So a lot of this is like very new for me, and I actually find it like very interesting. It's just not an area where I've had as much time to focus. With that being said, if someone is a little bit more new to typography, especially responsive typography, what's a good place to get started? Of course, like it sounds like your newsletter seems like an easy win. Any other like Medium articles or books that you can point to? I know you have your book.
So
we'll link that below. But anything else that you
there's a
can recommend?
lot of good places to start. Um, the I will say I wrote my book with that use case in mind. So like the first third of the book is sort of introducing some concepts of typography and sort of working up into the responsiveness of it. So there's that.
Great.
It's still mostly relevant. So, it came out in 2014. I feel pretty good about that. Um, the articles, the newsletter, sure. Um, but I'm like looking at my bookshelf up here. Eric Spiekerman's book, Stop Stealing Sheep and
Oh, that's
Learn
amazing.
How to Use Type. That's a great book. And I don't know if it has, I have to check and see what the status of it is. I know he's working on a new edition.
Oh, wow.
And that will be coming out at some point. I don't know when, but any of the editions of it are good. And also, Ellen Lupton's Thinking with Type is great. That's a really good. And there's a newer edition. Yeah, yeah, that's
That
by
was
Ellen
thinking with
Lupton.
type.
Really, really good. There's a gosh, there's a lot. Um, Inside Paragraphs is a really cool book by Cyrus Highsmith. It's a small one, and it really just looks at what are the elements of making a well typeset paragraph and why. And so, like, that's usually can be summed up. There's sort of three aspects to it. There's the type size, there's the length of the line of text, how many characters is that, and then what is the spacing between those lines of text. And those things are really tied. You don't really want to change one of those things without the other. And a lot of that is directly relevant to the web because how we read, what we're used to, is directly related to how well we can take that stuff in, and it sort of comes back again to like what is a good reading experience. The longer the line of text, the more space you need between them because your eye needs to be able to follow back to the beginning of the next line. Left aligned text
Right.
for people who read from left to right is always going to be easier and less tiring to read than centered text because your eye goes back to the same place at the beginning of each line. And then the smaller the screen, you can be a little bit closer together with the lines of text to maintain that sort of smooth flow of that. And because then if it's too spaced out, that also slows you down. So that's why I think all of these things like line height and font size and line length are all really important things to reduce that friction of the reading experience across these different screen sizes, and why I don't think there's one answer to what is the best typesetting for a paragraph on a small screen versus a large one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's an awesome list. I'll try to pull out some of those links for everyone listening as well, because I think that's an awesome,
There's
getting started guide.
I have
There's some awesome
I will
recommendations in
send
there.
you a link to a post that I have on Medium that is my go-to, here's stuff to learn about typography.
Excellent.
And it lists a bunch of books, and
Oh, that
it's
sounds
interesting. I
perfect.
wrote it a long time ago,
That's
and
great.
it still routinely gets like 100 views a week or so.
That's
I mean,
cool.
it's definitely, people find it, and I'm happy about that. So
That's awesome.
that's a pretty good starting point.
Cool.
Jason, actually, I want
we'll
to keep
bubble
asking
that
more
up.
questions. I'll keep you here for hours. I always like to ask the political questions. There seems to be, there was two schools of thought of typography. Type that's supposed to be read, and type that can be manipulated. And you have this sort of... I was a student in the 90s, obviously inspired by Ray Gun magazine, the grunge typeface,
Yes.
Neville Brody, where they basically broke all of the classical typography rules of taking text, make it into a graphic. All of my typography initial education was terrible for reading. So where do you... And we were talking about this with Mandy, because obviously she was taking type styles and trying to make editable type, but with these amazing Photoshop-esque
Right.
styles, whatever. And she was like, yeah, this is cool because it's like an experiment and something that you can do that's editable. Where do you sit on this fence of should type... Do we have to have extremist views about these things?
No, but the answer is yes. You need both of those things. So that's exactly what I was talking about with those dual roles of typography. Fantastic magazine cover design is not about perfectly legible type. I mean, what made Raygun so amazing, or Wired so incredible, or even just looking at a fashion magazine cover, the layering of those things sometimes slows you down, but it's engaging. it pulls you in and it makes you stop and think about the message that they're trying to get across. And so we do need both of those things, and doing it on the web, especially like the way that Mandy does it, is like our unique opportunity to still make it accessible to someone with a screen reader. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So stuff like that, um, I'm all for it, and so that's actually it's something that I'm going to be talking to the design team at Automatic in a couple of weeks, and that's one of the things I want to focus on. So think about a platform like WordPress.
Yeah.
What if we were building in these like widgets to like typeset stuff using variable fonts? And so it's not just like great reading typography, but being able to like build a homepage that actually leverages the flexibility of variable fonts to do something really interesting. Have some vertically set type, have text and image layered together, use mixed blend modes and masks and shape outside to wrap different kinds of text together. I mean, actually, that's a bunch of the things that I experimented with in talks in 2019 and somewhat in 2020, and in the newsletter were ways that we can bring those things together and look at those techniques in typography to do those really interesting things on an angle, skewed, wrapped around something
Yeah.
using these different CSS techniques. I mean, I learned a ton from Leah Veru and Val Head and Mandy and other people that have done tons of these things with CSS, and Una Kravitz too. She had this really cool like Instagram filter kind of
Yeah.
thing that
Yeah.
she created in CSS. So you can use all of those things, and then when you combine that with a CMS, you can add the image, you can set the text, you could choose the effect. Now we could actually give people the ability to like build up the headline for this story, not any story. Because like that's tons of people reference back to this thing, this episode of 99% Invisible where they talked about fighter jet design or fighter plane design in the military, where they in the US in the 40s or whatever, like they had standardized it around these like average measurements of pilots. And when you design something to fit everything, it is optimized for nothing.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'll go look up that podcast. It's awesome. I mean, what they realized, that's what led to adjustable seats and adjustable throttle settings and adjustable straps and everything, because people are different. Nobody is absolutely average. And so a design system is great, but then bringing the design back in when you're publishing is even better.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
you think about a newspaper design when the Titanic hit an iceberg. That was not set the same way that every other headline was set. It was here. Like it was massive. And so why can't we do that? Why can't we like set a headline that uses a width axis and a sizing that is tied to the width of the window to actually jam this headline like edge to edge and really make an impact? We can do that. It's all there. It's all there in viewport units and calc and clamp and variable fonts and width axis. You can get even crazier with that, like Amstelvar and Decavar, the
Yeah.
some of
Yeah.
the original variable fonts have all of these controls for like the height of ascenders and descenders and all this other stuff, so you can really do some cool typesetting with these things. And we just need to, I realize it's not sustainable to custom code everything. We've got to build it into a system, but that's what variable fonts enable us to do, is to turn web publishing into a thing where you sit the designer down and teach them how to use that tool. And now they could actually do the same quality of design that they were doing in print, but actually do something that could work on every screen. And it could work in an interesting way. And maybe it's vertical in one way and it's horizontal in another. We could embrace the fluidity of that design and take it as a challenge instead of throwing our hands up and saying, well, if it can't do everything that I think it should do, then I'm not going to bother. That's what graphic design has done on the web for years, and that's awful. And I want that to change.
Ryan, we've had Jason here for such a long time.
Well, I mean, I think this has got to be one of my favorite episodes yet, and I know that because I'm listening, not talking. Those are my favorite episodes where I just feel like I'm a sponge soaking up all this new stuff. But yeah, this was an awesome episode, Jason. I definitely think we should do like a part 2 down the road because there's so many more questions. So we'll post this. If people have questions, you can DM us or leave it in the YouTube comments so we can kind of figure out which topics for next time. But it was awesome having you, Jason, as a guest. Really, I mean, I learned a ton. This is like a packed episode, so feel free to run it back a couple times if you're listening. Mustafa, anything else before we sign off? Any closing thoughts, Jason?
I was not really kidding when I said I would talk about this stuff all day. So I really hope tons of people ask questions. I was all excited to talk tons about variable fonts, and I feel like we just barely scratched the surface. But I think
just touched on it. Yeah,
it just opens up so many possibilities, and so I've kind of been like, since they were introduced in 2016, like that's all I've talked about, because I believe in them so much, and Google Fonts, to their credit, I mean, we went from basically 0% usage on the web to 10% of the web fonts served last year were variable fonts.
That's amazing.
I mean, it's massive, and it's because Google realized the performance of this thing. That's what Mandy was talking about. It was way more performant to serve a single variable font than it was to serve all the static instances. And so nobody had to do a thing. And I think that's the ultimate testament to the technology, is that nobody even knew it was there. They just wrote their CSS, they did their design, and then, everybody reaped the benefits from those things just being served as variable fonts. And now that they are, let's be intentional. Let's really make use of it and start to really be expressive and think about that. Because in print design, you're going to use 10 weights of a font. You're not going to use 2. You're not going to use 3. That's not great typography. That's better performance. Now that we take the performance limiter away, we can do great typography.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask any more because we'll be here for another hour.
Yeah, I mean, let's just plan on doing a part 2 because there's so much to unpack here. Jason, where can people find you? I know we'll link your social stuff. Is there any place in particular you want us to point our listeners?
I encourage you to appreciate Tristan and Tilly on Instagram. On Twitter is a great place to find me and ask questions, and I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, I just followed. I love the dog content. We didn't even get to get into biking.
Actually,
it seems like you're a big biker, which is really cool.
Time before I went to college.
Oh wow, gosh, we didn't even have time to. We'll schedule part 2. This has been awesome.
Kind of thing. We'll get Mark Bolton and Rich Rudder and there's this guy. What is he? Tyler. There's a type designer I know in Philadelphia, who's also a cyclist. So we've got lots of crossover there. I know.
Gosh, perfect. We got to get a big meetup. That sounds like
Jay
it's perfect.
Pamental, all of them. So Twitter, if you want to ask me questions about stuff, I love to answer things out loud. I want everybody else to get a chance to see it too, and I can point people. There's tons of things on CodePen. I've got tons of repos on GitHub. rwt.io is my own site, and you can find the typography tips there. So all the things, all the code samples, all the everything is there, and plus tons of my talks and videos and stuff like that. If people are interested.
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, I think that's a great spot. We'll get the summary from the Medium post too, which we talked about earlier. But
likewise,
truly a pleasure for having you on, Mustafa. Thank you for the awesome connection, and then we'll do part 2. But that was a great episode of Design Huddle. Thanks everyone for listening, and if you haven't done so yet, make sure you subscribe, share this episode with a friend. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Design Huddle. The opinions expressed are solely our own and do not express the views or opinions of our employer.